My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
A beginning is a very delicate time. Know then that it is the year 2023. The known universe is ruled by sociopathic weirdos who were born into money. Oh yes, I forgot to tell you. We're looking at a scenario called Duneraiders.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Duneraiders is a complete adventure for the science fiction role-playing game Traveller. It was written and illustrated by William H. Keith Jr., with editing by Kerry Lloyd, layout by Michael Watkins, and graphics by Janet Troutvetter. The adventure takes place on the desert planet of Tashrakar. The player characters have taken jobs as crew members on an ore crawler, a land-based vessel commissioned by a corporation to dig up minerals on the desert planet. The company that has hired the player characters is worried about corporate sabotage that might prevent them from fulfilling the terms of their mineral lease, and so the player characters are there to prevent that from happening. During the scenario, they may have to deal with the aforementioned acts of sabotage, the twists and turns of corporate politics, treachery from a crew member, and attacks from the Duneraiders, which are tribes of locals who don't appreciate their desert sands being exploited by big mineral. Ultimately, the player characters may end up siding with the Duneraiders and attacking the various corporate interests on Tashrakar, a la Frank Herbert's Dune.
The contents of Duneraiders begins with an introduction chapter, which includes some pre-gen characters and notes for how to begin the adventure. Next is Firefight on the Loading Dock, in which the player characters, stranded on Tashrakar, fend off an attack on a smaller corporation's vessel. That smaller corporation then gives them the job on the ore crawler that makes up the bulk of the adventure. Next is a chapter on Tashrakar itself, its people and politics, flora and fauna, climate, maps, etc. Then comes a chapter on the ore crawler, which contains all the technical information you could possibly want on the ore crawler vehicle. Next is a chapter called Non-Player Characters, where we get descriptions of your ore crawler's NPC crew. Then comes The Plot, where several options for corporate sabotage your characters will have to deal with, such as ambushes and hidden bombs, are detailed. Then comes The Deep Desert, which is encounters and maps for after your ore crawler is disabled and you have to hoof it on the sand. Then we have a chapter called The Dakar Minerals Spy, which introduces a traitor to your group of NPCs. Then we have a chapter called Duneraiders, which is the various tribes, including their cultures and goals, and information about different adventure hooks involving them. Finally, we have a chapter called Wrapping Up the Adventure, which is exactly what it sounds like. Let's talk about our bona fides. Tom.
Okay, so I ran this as a one-shot, so not very much subtlety in the sabotage because I didn't have time, and I ran that using the Traveller-adjacent but quite compact game Any Planet is Earth. That was for 4 players. How about you?
I've just read it.
Okay.
So let's talk about things we liked about Duneraiders. Tom, I see you have some notes on presentation things. Why don't you start with that?
I do. Now, this is a very early product. I think this is like maybe even... I think it's the first third-party adventure, or part of that series that came out for Traveller. So we're talking early 80s at the latest, I think. And as such, this is not a very pretty book. It's kind of non-proportional font, single column. But what there is to like about it, I would say, is the art that is in there is unsophisticated but effective. It's line drawings, and it's in this sort of very retro, the kind of illustrations you would get in 1960s. Maybe not even sci-fi books, but maybe like what are the sort of the short story magazines that were around in the 60s, like Asimov's Worlds of Amazing Adventure or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. The thing you'd get accompanying a story in a magazine like that. The front cover, I think, is pretty good, actually. It's just a line drawing, but they've used this red to yellow color grading thing, like an old VHS cover. And
it has that VHS gradient quality.
Looks really nice. Good. Yeah. But it's pretty simply laid out, to be honest. Although, like I say, very clear. It's unlike a lot of these older modules. Sometimes, those black and white maps are hard to read. That is not the case here. The map of the ore crawler, which you spend a lot of time on, that's really good as well. Everyone enjoyed in our game kind of going, okay, I'm going to run down this corridor to here, and I'm going to climb down this ladder, and all this kind of thing. Yeah, that was quite fun too. So basic, but pretty well executed, I think.
Moving on to other things we liked about Dune Raiders. I'm going to say this is not something that's actually about Dune Raiders, but I actually really love that this module sort of speaks to the independent role-playing game creators' sort of compulsion to role-playing gamify everything, right? Like, this is essentially an answer to the question, what if Dune, but you were playing those guys on the mining rig, right? And I just kind of love that, because it's just nice to know that, like, even back in the 80s, this is what the hobby was like. I mean, if this came out in 2023, it would definitely be released on itch.io, and it would be called Spice Jockeys or some shit, right? Like, it's great.
It is, yeah. And you're right, it's wonderful. You could just see exactly how it came to be. Someone, the film wasn't out yet, so someone read Dune, thought, man, it'd be pretty cool to go around on those spice mining vehicles. Well, maybe I could do a scenario about that. Yeah. And there's a bit of Lawrence of Arabia in there as well, with the encounters with the Duneraiders. And that's it. Yeah. That's what happened, I think. But it's good, though. And in fact, what's sort of amazing to me is that it's... This scenario sort of makes Dune more interesting by making it more boring, which is a peculiar kind of genius. In that, like,
you have to explain that. Okay, explain that. What do you mean by
what
that?
it is? Well, you know, whenever a Dune game is proposed, part of the problem is, you could do anything you want. You can be a noble. You can be a sort of face-shifting assassin from one of the later, weirder books. You can do.
And everyone just wants to be a Bene Gesserit, so it's like,
and it's kind of too much. And a little bit of it is they've just focused on just being the minor guys, because there are sword duels in Traveller, there are psychics, but they don't really bother with them in this, and they've just taken the really mundane part of it and made a good kind of gritty, not quite wartime adventure out of it. Again, actually, in the sort of 60s mode of those men's adventure magazines about demobbed soldiers who are now doing tough work in tough environments, and getting hired as mercenaries and so on. And they've basically taken all the weird fun stuff out of Dune and said, we don't need that bit. We just want the sweaty men in a tank driving through a desert, and that's what you get. It's good.
I'm sold. Okay. Looking sort of big picture at Dune Raiders, I actually think this is a really cool module from a narrative structure standpoint. It has all the right beats that you want in a story like this. You start off these drifters stranded on a harsh desert planet. Those same characters then become accidental heroes. They get hired to do a job. The job, as you've noted, is sort of blandly interesting, but it does have some nice side characters. There's a traitor. You get stranded again, this time in the desert. You encounter some natives and ultimately join the native rebellion against the evil corporations and politicians. It just ends up being Dune in the end when it's all said and done, but it's Dune from this like really interesting perspective of down on their luck drifters rather than like messianic princelings of one of the big political families in the universe, right? So I think that's kind of interesting. And I just think that the structure, it just kind of hits these like really nice plot beats, which I think is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think you're right. That structure that it has. And interestingly, it's randomized in the hex crawling bit when you're driving around exploring for minerals, but it's calibrated so these things are probably going to happen to you. And there's a lot of advice in that later section about how to shove certain events to the fore. Yeah, as you say, it's got that perfect bit of not knowing what you're doing at first, mucking about on the ore crawler, kind of learning how to be a space miner. And as an aside, the justification for why this situation with these competing corporations is happening and why you have to drive around exploring rather than just setting up a mine is quite good, and it's given in the intro. Thousands of years ago, when the planet was cooler, the deserts that you're driving around in were seabeds, and so lots of deposits of different minerals were left in there, and they're enjoyably banal as well. Manganese, copper,
right? Yeah.
So on. And so they're now buried under the sands and rocks usually, but these violent storms also rack the planet, and when they blow through, they expose these mineral deposits. And so you've got a period of a few days or maybe some weeks where you can drive around and just spot them and dig them up, but then they're going to get buried again soon. So that's why you've got this weirdly nomadic mining operation. And that, I think, is, for all the talk we just had about it being a gritty adventure, that's a really good use of hard-ish science to give that sense of wonder that science fiction really depends on. A lot of Traveller adventures do that by having ancient aliens and mysterious pyramids and so on. But here they've just done it by going, look at how vast and weird a planet could be, and this is how metals come up out of the surface,
Well, and like instead of the storms and instead of the like exposed mineral deposits, they could have done the worms, right? I mean, they could have done something like that, but they chose not to. They like chose to have it be this much more grounded in reality approach, which you're right. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
It does again speak to the way they've like made the Dune story more interesting, or not more interesting, but interesting in a different way by making it mundane, which is fascinating.
For sure. And I claimed there were 3 really good bits, didn't I? Yes, so the Ore-crawler passage is good. The Duneraiders themselves are good. You're given to understand from the city dwellers that the Duneraiders are just like one big blob. But in fact, there are lots of different communities, and 3 different ones are detailed in the text. And the reaction rolls that you do on the little tables, or just the way they interact with you when you bump into them, differ because of that in quite interesting ways. So that was a really good thing in our game as well. This realization that you can't just deal with them the same from one group to another. And then the third thing that's really good is getting trapped in the desert, because suddenly the stakes are way higher.
Right, yeah.
Because everything you try and do is now wasting time and water that you maybe can't afford. You know, you've got the map, you know how far away it is to the next oasis, but the question is, can you do it? So for example, we had a bit in our game where half the party stuck around their crawler that was mostly busted to unload water and make a sort of travelling caravan for themselves, while 2 guys took the only still functioning but not big enough to carry everyone vehicle to the wrecked crawler they'd found elsewhere to try and get spare parts back. And in this situation, I found that like a hard letting the dice fall where they may approach worked really well, because it meant that I had to let that search for spare parts potentially fail, even though they're spending hours flying over there and back. And they did fail. And I looked at the dice and we all went, oh no, there's no usable spare parts. And of course the temptation was to go a bit, go a bit story gamey and let them have a reason for a second chance. Right, but then I thought, no, that's not the genre that we're in. We're in the genre where you go to the well, like in The Beast with Jason Patrick, you go to the well, but it's been poisoned by your allies, so you can't use it. Spoiler for The Beast, everyone. Yeah, which is a film about a tracked vehicle travelling around an arid landscape, actually. And these really sort of life and death decisions, but not in an immediate way. Not like sort of if I make the wrong choice now, I'm going to fall off a cliff and die right now. It was everything we get wrong now is going to contribute to us having not enough water in 12 hours' time when we're really, really screwed, potentially. And that was, it was just an amazingly good upping of the stakes, but still using the same skills you've developed through the first half of the scenario. So, yeah, just good. Like you say, good structure.
Yeah. Play to find out what happens, right? That's great. Other things that we liked about Dune Raiders, I actually want to note that I thought the NPCs were really good. The ones, the Ore-crawler NPCs, they are surprisingly textured. They have lots of like backstory and motivation. I don't know, they just felt like real people, which I think is great. Yeah, and it's a smart move, right? Because you are ostensibly spending a lot of time in this one confined space with them, so they should be interesting.
Yeah, and that section the first section they're presented in, before it gets to the GM only bit of why each one might be the saboteur, which is great, by the way. It's a movable saboteur. There could be more than one. They all have believable reasons, and in the death to clues approach, they just tell you what the backstory is, but they don't give you a trail of things to follow for each one. But that first section actually is their personnel file. So I just printed that out and handed it to the players at the table. Which is a good bit to do, because like when a couple of players are splitting up to do something like on some duty station, others were sitting there reading through the personnel files, trying to figure out which one they suspected the most. And we didn't do too much of the investigation part because it was just a one shot, but they got in a couple of tense interviews with people that they found some weapons under someone's bunk, and he was like, I didn't put that there, and of course he didn't. The saboteur put it there to frame him, and all that kind of classic business. That's good. So that was pretty good. My only complaint actually about those NPCs is there's only one woman in this whole adventure, and she's back at the office. Although she is your boss, to be fair. So I suppose there's that.
Indeed. The last thing I'll say about things I liked, I actually think there's a really terrific amount of GM support throughout this entire thing, particularly in how to play out the saboteur scenario, as you've noted. I also thought that the setting details were really quite good and helpful, and they're presented in a way that is very detailed, but it did not feel like overkill to me, which I think a lot of these older sci-fi modules in particular have a problem with, overloading you with information about the setting, and especially from a technical standpoint. And I thought they did a pretty good job here of managing the balance between like a decent amount of information that feels useful and findable and searchable and supportive without like going overboard. So I really appreciated that. But just in general, there's a lot of, okay, if you are the referee or whatever it's called in Traveler, do this, or think about this, or think about this. I always appreciate that in a text. Anything else you want to say about things you liked?
Yeah, one last thing I'd like to praise is the mystery of the handwritten note that you can find on a wrecked crawler that belongs to your company but went missing before. So you find it and it's been destroyed, but there's one thing, and it has a sort of a reference that, is a bit cryptic. You can figure this out by looking at the hex map you've been looking at for the whole session so far and actually reading the labels, which is a good place to have the answer, I think. And in our game, it was a good 20 minutes before anyone went, wait a second, this valley has the same name as what's written on that note. So, simple, but effective. Good.
I love it. Let's go to questions we had. Mine's pretty straightforward, and you've kind of answered it. But basically, I was just going to ask, were you able to do as much as you wanted to do in a one-shot especially? Like, were you able to get the full arc of the story, or did you have to short-circuit some things?
Sort of. Well, yes and no. I think we didn't get to meet all the three groups of the Duneraiders that live in the area, which I think was a shame. They didn't get down to that hidden but not hidden valley, which is sort of assumed to be the end point of the scenario. So we instead had a big showdown in the desert with the rival company. But yeah, by and large, I think once you've had the big bomb go off, or however it is that you cripple the crawler, that's it. You're into an end game of some kind. But I think you would definitely breathe better in 2 or 3 sessions. So you could actually take those 3 stages, maybe 1 per session. So session 1, mining. Session 2, probably the sabotage, actually, because it's hard to say whether you should run into the Duneraiders before or after that happens, and it can be both. And then session 3 is when you figure out what to do and then do it, I suppose. So yeah, 2 to 3 would be better, but 1 was fine. It was enough to have more of a 1984 Dune where you just cut out loads of stuff and have things going on that don't make a lot of sense. Yeah.
More on that later. Okay. Did you have a question or anything you want to talk about?
Oh yeah, one issue I want to raise is there is a bit of a sort of disconnect in the way the scenario kind of expects the players to be making decisions about where the ore crawler goes and what it does, even though they're just the security guards and they're not actually in charge. So in our game, what we did is we just agreed that whenever we were debating that kind of thing, we were playing some kind of abstract combination of the actual player characters and the crew of the ore crawler, and we didn't worry too much about who was really pointing to a spot on the map and saying, let's go there. But that is the thing you might want to mention at the beginning, so that halfway through someone doesn't go, wait, why are they listening to us? So but it's really minor. Overall, it's a very well assembled package of GM advice and scenario.
Fantastic. In that case, let's go to the Chain Lightning round. I will start. The composition of the illustration on page 42 is really something. I'm not going to spoil it here, but listeners, go take a look.
Check it out.
There's a lot of interesting choices made from a composition standpoint. Tom?
From the description of the Gabadak Arkrel Dunraider tribe. This tribe makes up for what it lacks in size with sheer bad temper. And then they have some interesting customs as well. Those who seek to meddle with the gift of the gods, i.e. putting water into tanks or reservoirs or pipes, and who hoard, fattening themselves to excess with the gods' gifts, i.e. storing water and drinking too much, are doomed to die at the hands of Shek-Kul, the periodic desert devil below storms, by being tied up and left in the path of an approaching storm.
Of the sand stinger, one of the bestiary entries, this is a small animal resembling arthropodal forms of other worlds. The front pair of its 6 legs have developed into shovel-form pinchers which it uses for burrowing. A whip-like tail delivers a potent neurotoxin through a stinger in its tip. The animal burrows into soft sand, remaining completely hidden. Animals of any size which tread near the sand stinger's hiding place may be attacked.
An even more unusual twist, says the GM's advice section, might find the players deciding to sell out to Dakar Minerals. In this version, it is recommended that the Talon Zen show up at their canyon for an all-out battle to the death.
Mm-hmm. The creatures in the bestiary hilariously have their scientific name listed with the name you actually call them by. I particularly like for the plant creature called a water store, Aquabundantia spina, which seems to translate to abundant water and spines, which definitely fits the bill looking at the illustration.
Speaking of that flora and fauna guide, I like the design of the Seric, which is a kind of horrible-looking horned lizard horse thing, although it's fairly harmless. To me, this just looks like classic golden age of American sci-fi creature design. Just really kind of half-baked, but also nicely grotesque. Yeah.
Let's go to the expert delve. Hi, listeners. Jason here. If you're enjoying this podcast, you should support it on Patreon. We here at The Gauntlet love making these shows, but there are a lot of costs associated with making them, and we depend on your Patreon support to cover those costs. A monthly $2 pledge doesn't seem like much, but it goes a long way towards us being able to make these podcasts. And if you pledge $6, you get early access to all the releases coming out of Gauntlet Publishing. At any given time, our Patreon feed has scenarios and playbooks for The Between, new mysteries for Brindlewood Bay, incursions for Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold, and more. $6 patrons also get early access to our big standalone game releases. We have 4 big games coming in 2023. Arkham Herald, Public Access, The Silt vs. RPG, and Moonlight Vale. And you'll get them early and at the best possible price if you make that $6 pledge. Remember, we can't do any of this without you, so head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and pledge today. Thanks. Our expert delve today is minigames. Tom, first of all, what do we mean by this? Maybe we should define it.
Yeah, I think I know what a minigame is, but maybe I don't. I think a minigame is where you have your main game, your main game system that you use all the time for exploring dungeons, fighting orcs, what have you. But every so often, there's some special activity where you switch to almost an entirely different game system, sometimes involving only 1 or 2 players whose characters have special attributes, like they're the hacker or the thief or the, I don't know. Actually, that's usually it. It's the hacker or the thief, isn't it? Oh, well, right, yeah. Sometimes the getaway driver gets a little mini game.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
And so you end up doing something a bit different from what you normally do. And I guess the name is derived from video games where, normally you're Link running around rescuing the princess, but sometimes you go fishing. And that fishing section has a whole different mechanism to what you normally use. Does that sound about right to you for what a mini game is?
Yeah, I mean, you could maybe make the case that you're doing a dungeon that has a puzzle, and then that puzzle is something that has to be printed off and pondered over by the group, and it has its own logic and its own rules. You could say that's kind of a mini game, but I think what you're saying is it's more of a regular thing that you sort of cut away to in the middle of the game, possibly. Yeah,
I suppose so, but I think you're right. What one-off ones are very real. Well, like in Duneraiders, there's special rules just for having fights between ore crawlers, which is a thing that will never happen in any other scenario. So I think it's fair to say that you do have one-offs, don't you, as well? And I think, I guess a puzzle would count. Yeah.
I think the key here is just you have your normal system that you play in and certain things that you do on a regular basis and you engage with, and then it gets interrupted briefly to do this special thing. I think that's probably sufficient to define the minigame, right? I think the more interesting question is, what's the advantage of this? Why do it? Why have them in your design? Why create them? And I think the obvious answer is when you make a mini game, you are sort of highlighting that part of the story, right? You are saying this part is special. It's distinct. It's meant to feel special. That sticks out to me as why you would even want to do this in the first place, right? Because otherwise just let whatever the thing that's happening, let it just sit inside your normal system, right?
Yeah, totally. It's to create a distinct feeling experience. I think it's a way of not just highlighting that it's different as well, of making it genuinely feel different. If I could give this is not really a mini game example, but the game Stars Without Number, which is of course I guess I was thinking about that because Traveller. I mean, Traveller itself is arguably just a collection of mini games. It doesn't really have a very solid central
Right,
mechanic, or I mean, the original one didn't, which is maybe historically why a lot of people found it vexing and confusing. But Stars Without Number uses a D20 roll for combat, but it uses 2d6 for skills. And my theory for the reason for that is that a D20 is a straight... this is probability stuff, strap in. No, so a 1d20 is a swingy distribution. Like, it's unpredictable. Whereas 2d6, more predictable, it's a curve, it feels more controlled. So when you're using your skills to, fix a spaceship, do some computer programming, different things can happen, but roughly you know what to expect. Whereas when you're in an action sequence with people firing lasers at you, predictability pretty much goes out of the window to some degree. And that sort of design choice, I think that is what you're pushing to more of an extreme when you decide to bring in a mini game. You're saying, like, this is going to feel different. I'm going to recreate some aspect of this experience by making you do different things in the game.
I actually really quite love this idea of the minigame as a way of highlighting something in the story or making a particular action or a particular moment feel different. Like, that really speaks to me both as a GM and as a game designer, frankly. I'm thinking a lot of, I think there's an interesting comparison to be made with Powered by the Apocalypse games and the way moves work in those games. So listeners, I've actually written about this, but I think that in a PBTA game, you have roughly 3 different types of moves. Mm-hmm. You have the basic moves, which everybody has access to and which cover like 75% of all the actions your characters take in the story. And then you have special moves that are mostly confined to the character sheets and playbooks, which is a narrower use case and it's specific to certain characters. And then you have, finally, the most salient part for this discussion, the custom moves, which are used very, very infrequently, and they are usually tied to really specific locations or actions. And what I love about that structure is the type of move you have depends a lot on the specificity of your fiction. So the general sort of actions that everyone takes, that's what the basic move's for. And then it kind of gets, as it gets more like narratively specific, you get like more specialized moves, essentially. And the custom move, whenever it comes out in play, is really fun because it signals to the players like, oh, this is different. This is special. It just has this signaling effect where the players are like super engaged with it and they know something special is happening. I think it's the same idea when you're talking about mini games. It's this signaling thing, which is fun at the table, right? And also it's just, from a design standpoint, I think it's just a fun thing to do. There's a certain part of like your brain that wants to fiddle with things and create. And you take an existing system, which works the way it works and is predictable in its way, and then having this little side thing. It's just fun design space, right? Because you can't mess anything up, which I think is great.
Yeah, that's true. Although, speaking of it being a side design space, I do want to kind of segue into what makes a good mini game. And one of the things I think is that it's a siding from the main line of your game, so it shouldn't be too different from what you normally do. It cannot take as long to learn your minigame as it took to learn Pathfinder, right?
Yep,
so it's got to be something where you are, much like the custom move in a PBTA thing, it's got to be something where you're taking a die roll mechanic, for example, that everyone already knows, and saying, okay, but this time when you get, whatever you roll on your damage, you're going to use those points to do something else, for example. That way you are making it different enough, hopefully.
I agree and I disagree with this idea that the minigame should be closely tied to the core system. I think maybe what I would say is I would just say you have to just be mindful of certain pitfalls if you're going to do the minigame. Like you said, it shouldn't take a huge amount of time, especially if it's something only one player does. I have been in those situations. I have played games, Shadowrun comes to mind, or other games, where we're all just kind of sitting there waiting for the player to do his little thing, right? Little hacking thing or whatever. And that's not fun. So, that's something to be mindful of. If it's something only one player does, it needs to be quick. I think another pitfall is that at a basic level, it has to work, right? This seems like an obvious thing to say, but I distinctly remember playing this OSR dungeon things a long time ago. And I can't for the life of me remember what dungeon it was, but we had this like puzzle we had to do and we just could not figure it out. And finally somebody went online to a forum to like research it, and it turned out like it's not solvable. Like, you know, it was like a broken puzzle. And so, you know, at a basic level, it has to work. It shouldn't take too long. I think as long as you're avoiding the pitfalls of the mini game, I think it's okay if the mini game is really different from what the core game is. I think that can make it even more special. But, you know, this is pretty intense design stuff though, right? Like, I don't think you can just like throw this out there willy-nilly.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, it's funny you bring that up, because there's me sort of saying, oh yeah, it should be pretty close to your central mechanic. But one of the examples I've written down in my notes for a good one is the lockpicking in the game Errant, which doesn't use any... It's got this thing where you just choose whether you're going to twist, bump, or do something else to a lock that you're trying to pick as your action. And I think that's really good, and I'm pretty sure that stuff doesn't crop up anywhere else in Errant, which is in itself kind of a big collection of mini-games. And that also has the advantage, you know, only one person at a time can try and pick a lock. It's infamously too many cooks spoil the broth on that kind of thing. And yet,
right.
Because it doesn't take too long to use this mini-game, it's still fun for everyone. You know, they can be doing other things. They could be fighting some goblins while you're trying to do it. And at the same time, the player and or their character, because it's based on... There's a thing where you can sort of memorize the combinations for certain colors of lock in the game. So you can demonstrate kind of system mastery and being good at stuff by remembering these things and then getting it right during the game. And that's fun too. So yeah, I don't know why I was insisting on it hewing close to the mechanics, as long as it's quick and doesn't upset people, you know.
I take your basic point, to be fair, because that is the advantage of the custom move approach, right? The custom move approach avoids all the pitfalls, right? While still giving you that special feeling. I would even say that, to back up your point, Tom, I would say that Trophy Gold's combat is essentially a mini game.
Yeah.
It's really quite different from the rest of the system. And yet it has like certain little touchstones like Ruin and Light Dice and Dark Dice and these other things that connect it closely enough to Trophy to where it doesn't feel out of place. But it is different. Like when you do the combat roll, it feels very different from everything else in the game. It's so gamey for one thing, but it's cool. Like when you do a combat roll, you really feel like you're doing something like different. It's like, oh, this is like a cool different thing. And so no, I take your point. I think there's just like pitfalls you have to be aware of. Whether you take this like close to the system approach or not, like you just have to be kind of mindful of that kind of stuff. Thinking about the minigame as like a design space, it's a fun way of creating within some boundaries. It's a fun way of like trying out something in a fairly constrained way without having to design a whole ass game, right? And I think that has value. In some very real ways, it can help you be a game designer, but also it kind of helps you from an analytical standpoint when you're looking at the game that you're actually designing the minigame for. It's an interesting new way of looking at system, and I think it's worth doing. Yeah,
because it's kind of win-win, isn't it, as well? Because if you find that you've developed a minigame that you just don't use that much, and that's okay, because it just means that nothing bad has happened. You just created a thing that you only use very occasionally, and then the rest of the time you're doing your main thing. But on those occasions when that's exactly what you want, there it is, and it's not done any harm, especially in this era of just having loads of stuff sitting on our Google Drives instead of occupying shelf space. So it's like you say, it's good to experiment with that kind of design thing as well, because when they work really well, mini games do give you that sensation as a group at the table of participating in specifically that activity. And there's something really compelling about that, especially actually ones that work with teamwork. We've talked about individual mini games, but there are a few around, like, for example, Stars Without Numbers spaceship combat thing, where everyone gets given a little crew position to do. Are you the pilot, or are you the gunner, or the captain? Right. The commander has a different kind of set of actions they can do. And they do have to work together and use action. I mean, I won't go into the details now, but basically each person has interesting things to do on every turn, and they're different from what everyone else can do, but they have to combine their forces, and that's always a fun time. Now, of course, that is a big mini game, so to speak, in that there's a lot of design going on there. But anything where you can, for a brief period of time, slow the game down and go into more detail on something that the whole group is interested in, whether they're doing it directly or not, that's a really good time to have a mini game waiting in the wings to come and get played.
I will note one thing about minigames, my last point, I guess, that I'd like to make in this discussion, which is I think you should be really mindful of how the minigame connects up to the narrative of your session. I think what you don't want to happen is to have your narrative momentum slowed down by the minigame. I have run into this a fair amount, especially when playing dungeons that have puzzles or procedures like that. Everything's kind of flowing nicely. The final boss is behind this door. We're so excited. But now we got to do this puzzle. It's going to take like an hour and a half. Your energy is kind of sapped a little bit, right?
Yeah.
The less you can disrupt the momentum of your story with the minigame, the better. Anything else you want to say about this topic?
For me, I think the overriding thing is that you've got to have a particular experience in mind when you're choosing or designing a minigame or deciding to use one. And there are some things that role-playing games don't do that well, and you should avoid making that the thing you're trying to do. To use a self-serving example, the chase minigame in my game Revolution Comes to the Kingdom is designed to be about making decisions, preferably quickly, although no one can force you to, but preferably quickly, about risks you're going to take based on the danger you see ahead of you. Basically, the mechanic is a kind of, do I take the path that's right in front of me, or do I swerve off and try something else? And you've got to decide based on the potential consequences of failing to clear that obstacle ahead of you, but also based on what you know about your own abilities, because each thing will use a skill or strength or some attribute of yours. And it was designed to be making decisions on those two axes relatively rapidly. And what it wasn't designed to do was to be kind of testing your twitch reflexes for actually driving a car very fast down a road, because role-playing games don't do that well. And I've seen sort of attempts to make that the narrative thrust of your chase minigame, and it never really works. The things that work best are more zoomed out mechanical things, like the horse chase in a Zane Grey novel, which is not about like two guys neck and neck jumping over fences and things on their horses. It's about like a pursuit for hours across the desert where they're trying to make their horse not die but still run fast enough to keep going in the horse chase. So yeah, you got to choose the thing you want to do and then choose the aspects that are going to come out well in a role-playing game, and those can be quite limited, to be honest. Yeah.
That's a really good point. Like, not everything is fun in a role-playing game. But you know what? If you can crack that thing, that's that people will love you for it. But yeah.
For sure.
Okay, let's go on to the next segment. Its companion adventures. Okay, so Dune is the obvious choice here.
Okay.
And given it's so obvious, I'm going to just instead give you my personal ranking of all the Dune things. Not sequels, just like proper Dune proper. The very first thing, the absolute best thing, is Jodorowsky's Dune, which is not an adaptation of Dune. It is a documentary about Alejandro Jodorowsky's attempts
about
to...
not an adaptation of Dune, yeah.
Right, about trying to adapt Dune, the intention to adapt Dune, and it was a kind of a magnificent disaster involving Dali and Orson Welles and some really fantastic visual design. It's a documentary. It's really fabulous. I recommend going watching it. It is the best Dune thing there is. Next, in my personal ranking, is the actual book Dune by Frank Herbert. I love it personally. I think a lot of contemporary modern readers frequently don't love Dune because it has a level of detail, especially the Dr. Kynes chapters, that I think people are not super into. And it has a lot of like this sort of like sociological and ecological like stuff that it does that is maybe like a little boring for some people. I personally really love it. I think it's a very rich, fleshed out world and universe. And it's a rare opportunity to go super, super deep into world building in a novel, in the context of a novel that's in a way that like I don't think is matched by maybe Tolkien, I guess. I'm not sure like what else matches it in terms of just like sheer world building on the page. I really love it. I read it once every 5 years or so. It's great. The next thing is probably most controversially, I think the David Lynch movie is next. The David Lynch movie gets dragged all the time because it's very weird. It cuts out a lot of stuff from Dune. It changes a lot of things. But in my opinion, the David Lynch Dune is a little bit better than the one that came out a couple years ago because it is more of an artistic vision, in my opinion. The Villeneuve Dune is very, very good, but it is a very straight adaptation of Dune. The David Lynch Dune is David Lynch putting his artistic vision on the screen, and I love it for that reason. It doesn't always work, but it's a big, big swing, and I appreciate that. Next is the 2021 Dune, which I think is a very solid and good movie. I enjoyed it a lot. It's kind of what I imagine Dune to be when I read the book. And then finally, Dead last is the 2000 sci-fi miniseries of Dune. Now, it's last on my list. It's technically ranked 5th on my list. I do think it should be ranked like 82nd, despite the fact there's only 5 things on the list. It's so bad, but maybe that's worth watching for that reason. I don't know. Anyway, my personal ranking of Dune stuff.
No, it's good. I'm on board with that. Of course, I haven't actually seen the last 2 things on your list of 5, so...
You haven't seen the new movie?
No, well, for a start, they've only done half of it, right? And secondly, the other thing is, when I looked at the trailers, similar thing. It's sort of how I saw stuff from the book. And the thing is, I've read the book, so I don't need to go and look at pictures.
It's an extremely direct adaptation. The Harkonnens are not as good in the movie as they are in the book. They're a little problematic in the book, but I think they're more fun in the book.
I don't know. I'll get around to it at some point, I'm sure. But,
yeah. All right. What's next on your... Let's do proper companion adventures now.
Let's move on from cavilling at sci-fi adaptations. I suppose the decent thing to do would be to do the role-playing game companion adventure first, which is Any Planet is Earth, the system I used to run Duneraiders. And this is, to be honest, our tightly focused one-shot did not play to its strengths because it is a 6-page, I think, game devoted to doing rules-light traveller adventures, but that are generated randomly. So it's all kind of sandboxy, emergent play. So then taking that and squishing it into here's a thing you're doing on a desert planet is not the best. But actually, mechanically, it worked really well. It has just enough going on to kind of get that traveller feel, and the probabilities feel about the same, and the tech level is similar. But I would love to play it as intended at some point in the future, because I think it's a really interesting little game.
Fabulous. I have a role-playing game recommendation as well. This is more of a, listeners, let's do this companion adventure together someday, as I have not actually played it yet. But that is Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast, which was a big successful Kickstarter from last year, I think. Having not read through it much, my understanding is that Yazeba's is, in fact, the whole game is just a collection of mini games, like dozens of mini games. And so I think that's pretty fascinating from a design standpoint. It's really, really intriguing, and I can't wait to dig into it someday. But since we're talking about mini games today, I thought it might be worth pointing out here.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thanks.
In the CD. I have a video game as well, before we move on from games. And that is The Legend of Mystical Ninja. This is a Super Nintendo game from the early 90s. I think it was originally in Japanese. I think it's called Goemon, if I'm not mistaken. I think I could be wrong about that. But in any case, what I love about it, it's probably in my top 10 video games of all time for starters. But what's really great about it is it has so many mini games. It's basically just a side-scrolling like little action RPG, and a really good one. But you occasionally like dive into these little like shops and do these like really cool mini games. There's like horse racing and card playing and like all this. There's like so many like different little things. And I remember I've played it actually in recent years, and I had that same sense of like, oh, this is just super cool. Like mini games are fun and cool, right? They're a nice diversion, and this one really turns the mini game up to 11. So
nice. All right, I will swing this back to films again and recommend Lawrence of Arabia from 1961. Man, this was recently put onto Netflix, or at least it was in Hong Kong. I don't know about other places. And I put it on one Saturday afternoon, I think it was, thinking, it's 4 hours long. I'm clearly not going to sit in front of it for that long. But I'll just put it on and I'll get some tidying done, do a bit of ironing, watch it occasionally when something exciting's happening. Listener, I watched the whole thing. It's really good. Surprisingly,
it's really good,
this classic multi-Oscar movie is really good, and it's very clearly a key inspiration for Duneraiders. And I think a lot of the things that are sort of hinted at, but maybe are not in the text of the adventure, if you have seen, if you remember most of Lawrence of Arabia, you'll be able to just import lots of those set pieces and visuals and all that kind of thing into Duneraiders with not too much difficulty. And man, especially the kind of remastered high quality version that just looks amazing.
It's beautiful. Yeah. Listeners, in case you needed a thumbs up for Lawrence of Arabia. You got it. So,
yeah.
Great.
A couple of other films I want to quickly mention, though, because I think they have that sweaty men in vehicles feel, are both based on the same novel. First one is The Wages of Fear, Le Salaire de la Peur, from 1953, and it's sort of remake or sort of just adaptation of the same novel, the William Friedkin film Sorcerer from 1977. Both these films are about... Wait, why is it they... Oh, that's it. There's a big fire that can only be put out by dumping loads of dynamite into it. But the dynamite that's stored at this mining camp has been improperly stored, so it could blow up at any second. And then you've got this convoy of trucks that has to go across these mountain roads with the dynamite. It's all very dangerous and horribly tense, and that's what both films are about, although they're quite different, as you can imagine. One's a sort of 50s French film, one's a very in-colour 70s American one. But I think there's a bit of Duneraiders in both of these films as well.
Love it. Well, listeners, that is our show for today. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on our website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We are on Twitter at GauntletRPG. Hey, we would love for you to come join us on Discord. We will have a link to the Discord in the show notes. And you can support the show financially by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. We always appreciate that very much. It's how we are able to make this show. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks also to our auriferous editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, yes, you, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.